So this, as you know, that this is an online lecture series organized by this Center of Buddhist Studies, University of Hong Kong. And this lecture series is sponsored by Glorious Sun Charity Foundation. So we have here a distinguished scholar for this lecture series, Professor Mario Poceski from University of Florida, USA. So today he will be delivering his sixth lecture on the monastic ideals and the pure rules for Chan monasteries. So I think in previous several occasions I have briefly introduced Professor Mario Proceski. So you are, I think, if you are new, I think for you, I will briefly say a few words about him. Professor Mario Proceski is a professor of Buddhist studies and Chinese religions at the University of Florida. So he has obtained his PhD in East Asian languages and cultures with the specialization in Buddhist studies from the University of California, Los Angeles. He has been a visiting scholar and professor in various universities worldwide. So he has also been to Hong Kong and China, and he speaks Chinese, and he's a recipient of many awards, and as you already came to know that he has under his name many publications, books, edited volumes, and journal articles. So he is today he is discussing in his specialized area of Chan Buddhism. And so let's invite Professor Mario Proceski to deliver his lecture. And also, I would also like to welcome all of you. So we had a small break around 2 weeks. So I hope you will have not missed much. So you can pick up from today on the series. So thank you, Professor Mario Proceski, for being present here also today on time. And so please start your lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's wonderful to be in touch, at least virtually, with wonderful colleagues from faraway places like Hong Kong. So thank you for the kind introduction. Also, thank you for those of you who either attend via Zoom or via YouTube. It's wonderful to be able to share something that actually, in terms of monasticism, I have both researched, but also before my academic career, also experienced firsthand in various places, including Hong Kong. So as it was mentioned, this is the sixth in a series of 10 lectures. We had a couple of introductions because of my travel. Earlier in the series, I traveled to Colorado, and I just came back from a trip to California. But from now on, there will be no interruptions. So all the lectures will be at the same time, once a week, until July 28th, when I guess you can say we will end on a prophetic note, talking about Chan prophecies. So when we talk about Chan, or when we, especially when we read the records, whether it's Tang Dynasty sermons or koans gathered together during the Song Dynasty, the kind of stuff that often is also taught now in Zen or Chan monasteries, kind of lectures, given lectures and so on some of these stories. We, of course, engage with those materials if you're interested in and interpret them, but our interpretation usually tends to be in terms of our own circumstances and that our own horizons of expectations, our own cognitive biases and suppositions and so on. And which is normal, natural. At the same time, there is a gap between the circumstances that led to the creation of those stories or sermons or sayings or ideas, and our own world in which we live, even if we are associated with particular Chan or Zen tradition, which claims to have direct link, to be our ancestry to some of the monks I'm talking about. But if you really want to have a better sense of, like when you read, I gave some of our previous lectures information about the sermons of Matsu or Baizhang and so on, then it's also helpful to know the context in which those sermons or those sayings or those ideas were formulated, enunciated, diffused. And there are, of course, different aspects to that historical context, but one of the key elements of the historical context is the monastic tradition. So most of us, I don't know, there might be some monastics in the audience, but most of us are lay people living in a modern society. Some of us, like I live in Florida, which is not a place known for its flourishing Buddhist traditions. I mean, we have some temples here and there, maybe some meditation centers, but it's a very, very different culture. And at the same time, and so we are kind of confronted with different worldviews, and we try to make sense of it. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about monasticism, because all those teachings that we covered so far were formulated and transmitted and shared within a monastic context. I'm not saying monastics were the only audience, but certainly pretty much almost all famous Chan masters were monastics. They live in monastic communities. They address their monastic disciples. They also address other audiences, especially officials, literati, emperors, and so on. So that's also to be taken into account. And I'm going to talk about the literati in China and the secular aspect of this whole milieu in which Chinese teachings were presented. But for today, I'm going to really focus on, I think, what is a key aspect of the whole Chan tradition, which is monasticism. But before we talk about Chan monasticism, if there was such a thing, or depending how we define it, let's start talking a little bit about monasticism in more general terms. One of the unique features of Buddhism, which distinguishes it from pretty much all other religious traditions to varying degree, is that the founder was a monk. Again, monk is, of course, an English term that developed in the context of Christianity and so on. But so I'm going to use it I'm going to use the English term instead of talking about Śramana or bhikshu or something like that, but kind of monk in a Buddhist sense, right? And he was a Buddhist monk. His main disciples, of course, he had lay disciples, but really the core of his disciples were monastics, and the tradition of monasticism continues all the way to the present. You can say that Buddhist monasticism is one of the longest lasting and most enduring institutions in human history, 25 centuries, right? That's quite amazing when you think about it. And also the context in which Buddha first started his spiritual path, at least in terms of the last lifetime that we are talking about, I mean, in terms of the historical Buddha, because according to Buddhist belief, Buddha practiced the Buddhist path for many, many lifetimes. So the final lifetime, the life of the Buddha, as we know it or we talk about it, is said to be culmination of a series of lives in which the future Buddha cultivated the bodhisattva path and strove to achieve perfect awakening. But so Buddha, when Buddha lived, he lived during very interesting times. It was a time of political, social turmoil and change in India. There were lots of also important transitions in terms of philosophical tradition and of course religion. And one of the important aspects of ancient Indian life at that time was the emergence of new traditions that challenged the authority of the Brahmanic establishment, which bases authority or a sense of identity on the Vedic tradition, right? So we have the so-called Śramana, or in Pali Samana, tradition. So this was a movement of various renunciant groups in which individuals went to what we can refer to loosely as monastic life. And then they would live society, maybe live in communities, practice, contemplate. They had different kinds of practices which are embedded in different ideas about the nature of life and reality and quest for transcendence. And this is also reflected in the Buddha's life himself. So I don't have time to go in the life story of the Buddha, but as you know, at the age of 19 or 29, depending on tradition, he have seen enough of ordinary life. He was born in a life of privilege, and he enjoyed the pleasures and also the benefits and that kind of life of privilege brings about, but he felt something was missing. And at some point in life, according to legend, he saw the 4 signs, right? He goes 4 times out of the palace, he saw the 4 signs, so he confronts the inevitability of sickness, of old age, of death, and he realizes the human condition is filled with all kinds of certain pleasant experiences, and there's joy and pleasure in human life, but inevitably there is an element of imperfection, of suffering, and that really that's something that is perhaps unavoidable for most people, but is something that kind of brings a kind of a sense of negativity to the human experience. So he wanted to do something, and the 4th site is the Śramana, right? So he goes around the 4th time in the palace, and he sees the meditating monk and says, aha, this is maybe the way out of this unfortunate predicament of samsaric existence infused with dukkha or imperfection. And of course, that's based also on the notions of impermanence and so on. So he makes his big renunciation, and then he embarks in religious quest, and he becomes a samana or shramana. He becomes a wandering ascetic. He studies with various teachers. He engages in ascetic practices. There is this beautiful statue you can see on the screen. This is the future Buddha. So at this time, Siddhartha Gautama was still a bodhisattva, a Buddha to be, or somebody who is practicing to become a Buddha. So his body is emaciated, kind of you can see his ribs and so on, because he practices extreme fasting and other ascetic practices. So this was a mode of spiritual practice, which was embedded in certain ideas about the nature of life, including the imperfection of samsaric existence, the promise of salvation, moksha, and the notion that through ascetic practices, by mortifying the body and starving the mind from desires and so on, attachments, one can achieve liberation from the cycle of birth and death, that is to say, transcend samsara. But he realizes that that's not the way, and that he sits under the Bodhi tree and he becomes a Buddha, he becomes awakened. But then one of the first things he does after that is to go to his former followers. When he was a samana, he had several other ascetics that were following him, and he gives a sermon, right? According to the Pali tradition, there's the initial turning of the Dharma wheel. There is a sutta, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, right? Which supposedly describes the content, the middle path, and the Four Noble Truths, and so on. And this is really the origin of the Buddhist monastic order. So then those 5 disciples become ordained, and then becomes the foundation of the Sangha. And then the story of the Buddha's life was, I mean, after he became a Buddha, of traveling around India, meeting people, and those who were especially inspired by his mission, becoming a monk, practicing under him, also meeting lay people, commoners, poor people, rich people, powerless, powerful, and so on, spreading his message and so on. But what perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Buddha's legacy is the establishment of the Sangha, the monastic order. Sangha literally means community, so sometimes it's also used in the context of the Buddhist community as a whole, but here used in the context of the monastic community, which is how usually the term is used in China or much of Asia. One of the unique features of Buddhist monastic life, which in a sense was revolutionary at the time, was that Buddha also allowed females to enter the monastic order. So he establishes the Bhikshuni or Bhikkhuni order, and which continues down to the present. Now, those of you who follow contemporary Buddhism probably are familiar, excuse me, with some of the issues about Theravada ordination for females and so on. Actually, when I was in California, I was interviewing some monks. This issue came, and this was almost like a schism within some of the monastic communities. But in the case of Chinese Buddhism, this tradition, females have been part of the monastic community actually from early on and continue to be down to the present. As a matter of fact, in some parts of the world where Chinese tradition is dominant, Taiwan being maybe the prime example, you have more females, more bhikshunis than bhikkhus by a large margin. And this was kind of quite revolutionary. I mean, if you look at the role of women, I mean, it's still in various religions, there's debates about, I don't know, female priesthood and so on, or even worse in some more conservative countries, you know, whether women can drive a car or whether they always have to cover themselves and so on. When you put yourself in the context of Indian society 25 centuries ago, this was quite revolutionary. So what is it? What's the idea behind monastic life? Well, at the core is that monks and nuns are different. So there is a sense of monastic distinction that they are unlike lay people. And the basic idea is that one leaves society with its manifold obligations. I mean, if you get married, you have children, I don't know, probably they didn't have to pay taxes the way we do, but you have to get a job, taxes. I mean, I'm just talking contemporary life. I don't know, my fence is broken, I have to hire somebody. I don't know, last week I pulled something and I have to, my cable company, something, bill messed up, I have to contact them. So if you're a monk, you don't have to deal, ideally, sometimes monks in contemporary context also deal with lots of bureaucratic matters, but ideally, if you just live a very simple monastic life, you just leave society, you're not married, so you don't have to worry about children. Your alms, you go for alms, so you're mendicant, so you don't even have to cook your food and so on. And you live it ideally, if one kind of follows this ideal as supposedly is meant to be, one can practice, one can dedicate himself or herself to spiritual cultivation, goes through the stages of the path and hopefully awaken to some of the truths that the Buddha himself experienced under the Bodhi tree and that communicated to humanity. So now I'm going to say, as probably you know, I mean, not all monastics follow this path in its absolute purity and perfection, but that's the basic idea. So let's look here. I kind of identified a couple of verses from the Dhammapada. This is a very popular work included in the Pali Canon. There were other versions in other pre-Mahayana traditions. But this is a translation I kind of adapted from some previous translations. So let's read this. This is basically about the monastic distinctions, what being a monk is all about. So this is chapter 25 in the Dhammapada, a couple of verses. The first one goes like this. The one restrained in hands, restrained in feet, restrained in speech, the one of supreme restraint, delighting introspection, composed, solitary, contented. That is what they call a bhikkhu. And then the next one. These are the foremost things for a bhikkhu with insight, guarding the sense faculties, contentment, and restraint in the patimokkha, associated with good friends, who are living purely unwearied. Patimokkha, those are the rule of monastic discipline. In the Theravada tradition, there are 227 of them. In the Dharmagupta tradition, I'm going to talk about it in a little while. There are 250. This is the tradition that becomes dominant. There is not a single version of the Patimokkha, but but the rules are quite similar actually, so that they're monastic rules of what monks should or shouldn't do, right? And good friends, that's Kalyana Mitta in Pali. This is the notion that like in early Buddhism and even still in Theravada, you don't have the notion of like Zen masters and gurus, so those kind of dynamics that involve hierarchies of power and different sense of relationship. But when one follows the path, one associates with good friends of people who embody the teachings, who strive, who are good practitioners, who absorbs the teaching and manifest them to the words and deeds, and who are able to provide inspiration and guidance along the path. In this case, good friends can be interpreted to be associated with people who are on the path of maybe good monastics, right? So you live in a monastic community and you associate with good friends, which also means you don't associate with bad friends, people who are dissolute, ignorant, living hedonistic, meaningless lifestyles, and so on. And the idea here being that the social context in which our life unfolds have influenced the people we interact with. So these are basically two good friends who are living purely, right? So this is this idea of pure life and so on. And so you have monastics, but then as the community grows, all kinds of people come into monasticism. Sometimes people have this idealized versions of what monks are like. You know, this kind of enlightened individual just sitting in samadhi and being very pure and so on. For those of us who have lived in monastic communities for a little while, we know that's not really how it works. I mean, once institution becomes established, it attracts all sorts of people, right? And so if you have a group of people, you have to have of various backgrounds, various inclinations. I might be very spiritual and maybe aspiring towards holiness. I might be joining monastic life for all sorts of reasons that are not particularly holy or pure. So you have to have some kind of rules, regulations. I mean, in any social group, you have to have some kind of common basis of what is proper conduct, some code of ethics and so on. And this was also the case with the context of the ancient Indian communities. So according to tradition, the Buddha himself set up the Vinaya, which is the Pali and Sanskrit term that is used to point to the code of monastic conduct, the monastic rules and regulations. How much Buddha really codified this, how much was the work of his later generation of disciples, we don't know. The actual Vinaya, the large body of text, obviously is later, I mean, but perhaps Buddha set some of these things in motion, but it's impossible to know exactly what he did, though. I mean, many Buddhists might believe that, you know, the traditions they have can be traced back to the Buddha, but historically speaking, that's problematic. But anyway, so you have codification of various rules and for the Buddhist monastic community, some perhaps set up by the Buddha, certainly elaborated in greater degree by his disciples, and the Vinaya becomes very, very important part of not just the institutional history of Buddhism, but also it's embedded in the mode of practice that the monastic followers have to follow. There is this famous story told in the Pali Canon and elsewhere, like when the Buddha is about to pass away and Ananda comes to him and says, well, who are you going to anoint as your successor, because you're gone, so we need some kind of leader. And Buddha said, I'm not going to anoint anyone. So here he wants to shift the focus from following a person, an individual, to something else. And this is very, very important decision. This is a huge ramification for the whole history of Buddhism from that point on. In other traditions, I mean, like Islam, for example, some of the quibbles we have between Sunni and Shia are really about ancestry to Muhammad, right? So who was the proper ancestor? It's almost like a family tradition in which there is authority passes from from father to son in a patriarchal lineage. In Christianity, we have the papacy establishes and kind of rules over these complicated ecclesiastical structures in church. There is nothing analogous in Buddhism. So if there is no founder, if there is no successor to the founder, then who should the disciple of the, not who, but what should the disciple of the Buddha follow? And according to this famous story, Buddha said you should follow the Dhamma and the Vinaya. So the teachings of the Buddha, which points to this ineffable transcendental truth that the Buddha supposedly realized under the Bodhi tree, and the code of monastic conduct that he supposedly developed for his monastic community. And this becomes a very, very important part of the tradition, more emphasized in some tradition. This is still kind of a guiding principle, let's say, in Theravada monasticism, maybe certainly not so much in, let's say, Japanese Zen, where there's no real monastic tradition kind of to speak of. So this becomes, and then as these rules are established, so the Patimokkha or Pratimoksha are the basic rules, and the Vinaya is the whole body of literature, and this becomes a very important part of the Buddhist canon. So there are many, the rules themselves, but there are stories about the rules, explanations about the rules, and so on, and many other materials about monastic life. And as the Buddhist canon develop, or Buddhist canons, there is not a single canon. This becomes one of the main parts, like in the Tripitaka, the three basket kind of taxonomy of the Buddhist canon. This is the second one. So you have the Sutta in the Pali canon, the Vinaya, and the Abhidhamma, right? So the three parts of the canon. In the Chinese canon, this is the basic structure, but becomes much wider and more complicated. But certainly, Vinaya is very much part of the Chinese canon as well. Now, here, before I go telling you about the transmission of monasticism in China, let me bring a little bit caveats. If you read the Buddhist scriptures, and if you read the Vinaya, I mean, in the Vinaya, actually, there are lots of stories about misbehaving monks. And actually, the rules were presented and formulated and explained because people were breaking the rules, right? So in the various stories about the origins of the specific rules you find in the Vinaya, there will be some of these stories are very explicit, actually, about how it came to be. I mean, about sexual activity and this and that. So some monk, I don't know, had sex, and the Buddha said, gee, this is not what you should be doing. So he said, knock it off, this is not proper. And then he said, from now on, you can have sex. And then the question arises, well, what is sex? What kind of sex? And then you explain, well, this, and so on. But that is framed in terms of monks misbehaving, right? And they breaking certain rule, and then people complain and come to the Buddha. And Buddha kind of objurgates that, decides, well, okay, this is proper, this is improper, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, and then codifies a rule. That's the whole structure of the Vinaya. So keeping that in mind, so monks and nuns come of all various forms. You have pious individuals who join monastic life and try to live a pure life to the best of our abilities, and then as probably most of you are aware, there are also all kinds of people who join life. I mean, you have this ultranationalist in Myanmar that was in the news calling to, I don't know, exterminate the Muslims, the Rohingya, and you have these bling monks in Thailand, I don't know, private jets and lots of money, and some of the women, I mean, all kind of horrible stories. And then you find that across religious tradition, the pure and the pious, and of course, there are also the misbehaving priests. I mean, like probably I've read in the news, 300,000 children have been sexually molested by a Catholic priest in France, and of course in our country we have. And you would think, okay, maybe Catholics are dead. Then you look at Protestants. I mean, different because they don't have celibate tradition in Protestantism, but it's kind of as bizarre. And then, of course, lots of salacious stories about Buddhist monks misbehaving and so on. So keep in mind, so when you look at these lofty ideals of monasticism and strict rules, and so they are kind of maybe templates of how to lead monastic life, maybe source of inspiration, maybe points of guidance, but of course the reality of monastic life is that it attracts all sorts of people. Some are holy, some are not, and from my experience, most are not particularly holy, and many are in between. I mean, people who, might not be, terribly awakened and so on, but maybe are trying. And of course, it depends from context to context. Some monasteries might be very strict with good monastics. Some might be just money-making places. They just do rituals or whatever they are doing. So keep that in mind. So basically, this kind of dichotomy between actual rules and the reality of human nature and actual monastic behavior. And not just actual monastic behavior, but actual human behavior, right? I mean, this applies to lay people as well. So this brings us to the transmission of monasticism into China. So monasticism was very, very important part, perhaps one of the central parts of the transmission of Buddhism into China, which, as you know, started during the 1st century. And it was really driving force throughout the course of the history of Buddhism in China, and continues to be so all the way into the present. Now, in the case of China, it's interesting because when monasticism entered, as I explained, monasticism was grounded in Indian traditions, right? Even before Buddhism, there was something we can refer to as monastic or samana traditions, right? So that kind of religious way of life was accepted part of the religious, social, cultural landscape of India. When Buddhism came to China, there was nothing analogous in China. I mean, there were maybe some hermits living in the mountains or disaffected officials who live a life of seclusion and so on. But there was no monasticism as an institution or an ideal, or something that was completely new in China. And at the same time, China had already quite a long history. We are talking about this is 1st century of the Common Era, but now we don't have to go into mythologized versions of Chinese history, like 5,000 years of history and all this kind of stuff. I mean, Xia Dynasty and so on, which kind of, I don't know what it have got to do much with contemporary China, but certainly Chinese history was very long, and Han Dynasty was along with the Roman Empire, one of the two major centers of civilization in the world at that time. So, so there was a sense of cultural identity. There was a society, political systems, institutions that were already in place, well established. So then when Buddhist monks come to China and try to bring Buddhism and establish both the religion and the monastic community as an integral part, maybe central part of the religion, they have to contend with local culture and local society. So there are all kinds of criticisms articulated by various upper-class Chinese officials, usually from the perspective of Confucian ideals and teaching and institutions, which were driving force behind the political philosophy of China by this time. This has become established in China during the Han Dynasty, like it starts with the 2nd century before the Common Era. So you have this kind of Confucian outlook in which there is very little place for monasticism. So the monks are criticized. I mean, probably you're already familiar about it, but very briefly, for not being filial. So filial piety is important part of Chinese way of thinking and Chinese culture, the notion that it's important to have son, and the duty of the son is to continue the family tradition by marrying and having children, so that the line, the ancestral line, can continue, because by this time ancestor worship is very central part of Chinese life. And so if a son embraces celibate life and doesn't have children, obviously that kind of creates problems for this transmission of the family lineage. Monks are also accused for being unproductive. This is almost, the communists pick up on these themes in the 20th century, that they are not laboring, they're not producing, they are asked to be exempt from taxes, they don't toil the fields and so on. Also, there are xenophobic, you can say even racist attitudes among some Chinese. These are foreigners. You can find similar what we have now in America. I don't know, like Trump with Mexicans. These people are rapists, this and that. So that you can find that kind of rhetoric in China. These are foreign people, and our culture is superior. So why would we like to accept the religion of inferior people? So there are various lines of criticism, and of course, perhaps the most important one is how to integrate monastic institutions into the political system of China, because China have authoritarian system of governance. I mean, you have now, but it's not a new thing. So you have this kind of sense of hierarchy, social hierarchy, and control that ultimately rests with the emperor, who is considered to be son of heaven. So kind of the emperor himself is not divine, but have connection with the divine realm, and the authority there is derived from this mandate of heaven. But then all subjects in the empire basically are subservient to the emperor, at least in theory. So the emperor have absolute control over the whole populace of China. So how do you then integrate a monastic institution in this kind of already established system? And that takes quite a while, and I'm going to come to this point in a moment. So there are all kinds of debates about how to integrate monasticism, both as an ideal, but also how to integrate monastic institutions within the Chinese social and political systems. And what's the relationship between the Sangha and the imperial state? So this continues, and I guess you can say to some degree still continues to this day. Important chapter in this protracted story about the integration of monastic idealist institution in China features Huiyuan, arguably the most famous monk from the early period of disunion and Baizhang, northern and southern dynasties. So the Han dynasty collapses, which is a long-lasting dynasty which establishes centralized rule of what we can loosely refer to as China. Of course, they call themselves Han, not China, but Zhongguo actually as a concept already exists. And then, so this is when Buddhism first enters. Then in 220, Han dynasty collapses, and then there is this long period where actually you don't have unified country you can refer to as China. There are various dynasties. So Huiyuan is one of the most important monks who was especially active during the late 4th, early 5th century. And this is a very important period in the development of Buddhism in China. So he emerges as a prominent monastic leader during the later part of his life. And then he becomes almost like a spokesperson for the Buddhist community, even though actually he lives at Lushan, the famous mountain in northern Jiangxi province, which now is a major tourist attraction. And he establishes a monastery there. So he actually, from this remote monastery, he still manages to exert lots of influence across the empire. And at that time, I don't going to go into too many historical details and names, but basically there was a new ruler of one of these dynasties, and he establishes anti-Buddhist policy. He wants to restrict the power of Buddhism and to control the Buddhist clergy to a large degree. And this is a common theme. You have some emperors who try to destroy Buddhism even, or maybe restrict it to some ways. So you have Buddhist persecutions or various efforts to control the monastic order. And then you have other emperors who are very keen to promote Buddhism. So it kind of goes up and down over the centuries, depending on the whims of individual dynasties and rulers. Anyway, so there was this warlord who becomes ruler. He actually is not a ruler for a very long period of time. He establishes his new dynasties, and he institutes certain policies that are unfavorable to the Buddhists. And then Huiyuan becomes defender of the Buddhist community. And this is a famous debate. In being China, the debate actually revolves, it's not framed in terms of church versus state relationship, at least not explicitly, but in terms of something that is very symbolic. should monks be required to pay obeisance, that is to say, to bow in front of the ruler? Because within the totalitarian system of Chinese imperial rule, everybody is subservient to the emperor, and you express your subservience to the emperor by bowing in front of the emperor. But within the context of Indian monastic traditions, monks are much held in high respect, and this is not Buddhist custom. Because they are renunciates, so they are not expected to show it. If there was somebody who bowing in the Indian context, it would be the ruler. You can still see if you go to, like, I don't know, Thailand or Sri Lanka or something like that, monks will never bow to the president or something like that, because religious life is supposed to be, at least in theory, if not actual practice, higher than secular life. So this is kind of, so this is the symbolic aspect, and subset of this is, should monks also bow to their parents, which is aspect of filial piety, which is also very important element of Chinese belief in social and religious practice. So there is this record treatise that supposedly summarizes this debate. So first, in the first part of the treatise, Huiyuan says, Buddhists are two types. They are lay people, and then he describes lay people. He says, you know, you don't have to worry about lay people. They are moral people. They are good subjects. They pay respects to the ruler. There is no problem. You know, actually, we would like to have more Buddhists because, you know, you have a populace that is moral and kind of follows the rules and does not create problems and so on. And then second one, right? So second, they are the monks. So I'm going to read this. Monks are able to leave the secular world in order to pursue their spiritual aspirations. They do not follow social conventions, so they can realize the way, the Tao, right? Having abandoned social conventions, their robes do not accord with the rules of propriety prescribed in the secular classics. These are the ancient Confucian classics, which tells how you should dress and so on. So they look different, yes. Having left the secular world, they are obliged to act in a lofty manner. Monks of great virtue are able to save a sinking world from drawing into the stream of samsara, as they pull out the mysterious root of bad karma accumulated over recurring years. So monks are different, but different in a good way. They follow spiritual way of life. They act in a lofty manner, and they have positive influence on the world. And then he also going to elaborate further on the benefits of monasticism. Even if only a single monk were to attain perfect virtue, then the true way will extend to the six close relations, and its benefit will spread throughout the world. This is a very Buddhist way of thinking. It's how do you transform the world? By transforming yourself. So if a monk can awaken to the truths of Buddhism and can embody those truths with his or her, if it's in the case of non-actions, then they become embodiment of these lofty ideals and truths that Buddhism supposedly is communicating to humanity. And in that sense, they can benefit. So to change the world, you change yourself. And by changing yourself, you bring virtue, compassion, goodness, wisdom into the world, and then influence others also to go in that direction. And then if more people can behave ethically, can manifest compassion, can be honest, and so on, then we improve the world. So here I continue. Although he does not assume the position of royalty, such a person assuredly contributes to the empire's effort to benefit the common people. This is he's responding to common criticisms that monks are just sitting in their monasteries and not producing anything and not benefiting anything. He said, you know, they actually benefit others, even though they live very simple lives. Therefore, although inwardly monks turn their back to the nature of feelings, of emotional attachments towards their kids, so this is kind of not towards filial piety and so on. So yes, you live your family and you don't practice filial piety in a conventional way, but they do not betray the virtue of filial piety. This is a common theme, that really true filial piety is to embody the way, to realize the Tao, to become a perfected human being. And that's how you repay your debt to your parents and society and transform the world and so on. Outwardly, although they do not show the conventional form of respect due to the monarch, they do not violate the virtue of reverence. So here the previous sentence was about filial piety, which was kind of this sub issue in this kind of whole debate, and then the last sentence addresses this. Yes, we as monks cannot, because of our rules and regulations and ideals, bow to the emperor, because we are separate in different ways, and this kind of independence of monastics from the direct control of the bureaucratic government and the emperor and so on is very important part of their tradition. But at the same time, we really don't violate the basic principle. We don't pose threat to this firmly established Chinese system. So basically what he's arguing is that monks should be allowed to be independent, that they shouldn't be fully integrated within the system. They don't threaten the system, the imperial system, the structures of Chinese society, the political philosophy, and so on. They can be integrated, but they have to be afforded a sense of independence so that they can pursue their spiritual way of life in relative peace. And by doing that, they can make contribution to society as a whole, including, of course, the emperor and the state and the common people and so on. So this sets this kind of relationship between the state and the Buddhist community, and this goes on for centuries, actually, all kinds of debates like this. I've written on this, and of course others also have written, it's a losing struggle for the Buddhists. I mean, they manage, of course, Buddhism flourishes in China, especially during the Tang Dynasty, maybe to a lesser degree Sung or even Yuan and Ming Dynasty. Well, Qing also, I suppose, and there's survival of Buddhism now. But really, within the Chinese context, Buddhism is always subservient to state power in institutions, right? So, as Buddhism is transmitted into China, one of the major challenges facing Chinese Buddhists, especially Chinese individuals, male and female, who decides to enter monastic life, who become inspired by the teachings of the Buddha and or for a variety of other reasons, enter monastic life, how to organize a monastic life. And I mentioned the central importance of the Vinaya. So this becomes a challenge, and for the first few centuries, actually, the Chinese do not have access to the whole body of canonical literature we refer to as the Vinaya. And then over this, gradually, several versions of the Vinaya translated. Now, probably the best known and the most studied is the Vinaya of the Theravada tradition. And like personally, also in terms of my own familiarity, there's a tradition I'm most familiar. But of course, that was not the only Vinaya that existed in ancient India, or the ancient, not just India, but Theravada is much at some point primarily focused on Sri Lanka and then moved to Southeast Asia. But there were various groups, the so-called Pre-Mahayana, or you can say early Buddhist Nikayas. They have their own Vinayas, Dharmagupta, Mulasarvastivada, and so on. Sarvastivada also, so they have their own Vinaya. So there was not a single version of the Vinaya, and so the Chinese translate several versions. And then by the Tang Dynasty, they pretty much settle on one of those as kind of the basis of Chinese monastic life, the so-called four-part Vinaya, which is the Vinaya of one of the Indian pre-Mahayana or non-Mahayana groups, the Dharmagupta school. And this becomes the dominant Vinaya in China. But really from early on, kind of Vinaya, maybe they take the Vinaya more seriously, and there's kind of this kind of devotion that new converts usually show when they kind of engage in something that is in that religion that was not the religion of their parents and so on. So there was lots of enthusiasm about Vinaya monastic life and so on. But really from very early on, there's a tendency in China to adopt the Vinaya. And this is part of this larger process of transmission and acculturation and transformation of Buddhism in China. And that leads to the development of native monastic traditions, which is what I'm trying to address today. So Chan being, of course, very important part of that. So this transformation of the Vinaya unfolds on different levels. One way to look at how the Vinaya, not just the text, canonical texts are there translated, so you don't transform, you can interpret or misinterpret. But then in addition to the canonical texts included in the canon, Chinese monks create all kinds of regulations, related regulations about monastic life and aspects of communal living and relationship with the laity and so on. So even before various versions of the Vinaya translated into China, Daoan, who was before Huiyuan, I mean, there's close relationship. Daoan was more centered in the capital, and he was very important monk at a time when there was still no full version of the Vinaya translated to China. He created his own set of rules, and this becomes actually an important feature of Chinese Buddhism, creating various rules that are maybe inspired up to a point to the Vinaya, but really deal with various aspects of monastic life. So he creates the true rules. I've written somewhere, others have written, so you can find those details if you're interested. And then Dao Xuan, perhaps the most famous Chinese monk associated with the Vinaya tradition, especially the so-called Nanshan or South Mountain tradition, he writes many texts about monastic life, in which he discusses various aspects of monastic rules, observances, practices, and so on. Here I have a couple of titles. He have many other texts that I don't want to bother you with too many titles, but just to give you an example. Also, as different traditions of Buddhism emerge, they create their own rules. For example, Zhi, the famous Tiantai patriarch, writes this Li Fa, establishing regulations. It's a set of rules for his monastic community. And Tiantai, he also briefly describes the context. So here you can see, both in a more generic sense, you have traditions of Buddhism that emerge and kind of create a new body of monastic literature about ethical observances and communal aspects and Buddhist institutions and so on. And then when you have a new community, or which eventually becomes a major tradition in Chinese Buddhism, namely Tiantai, Zhi also creates rules about his own community. The important part here to kind of be mindful of is what's the relationship with between the Vinaya, which is the canonical part that is translated from Sanskrit mostly, and the native Chinese rules created by Buddhist monks. Are they to replace the Vinaya, or are they to supplement the Vinaya to address certain issues that are maybe not clearly articulated in the Vinaya, or to deal with some local circumstances, or to create rules that are specific for some community? Traditionally, modern scholarship on monasticism, Chinese monasticism, have favored the first view. And this is under the influence of Japanese scholarship, which still is perhaps the most voluminous in terms of describing these processes. So basically, the Chinese didn't like this Indian tradition. They tried to create their native tradition. This is a revolution of Buddhism. They tried to reject the Vinaya, create their own rules because, well, their culture was superior and they didn't want to follow Indian rules and so on. The historical reality is a little bit more complicated, and that's kind of not exactly what happened. And the argument I'm going to make here today is that really you have gradual transformation of monastic ideals and practices and institutions, adding of new rules, adding of maybe new ways of looking at monasticism, and also reflecting on its relationship with society. But at the same time, that never really replaces the Vinaya. Yeah, it's true. Probably aware Chinese monastics now don't follow many of the basic Vinaya rules like not eating after noon and those kind of things, or handling money and so on. But the basic spirit, and certainly the ordinations are still based on the Vinaya and so on. So this is kind of something that is added to the Vinaya rather than replacing the Vinaya. And certainly this is the case I'm going to make for channels. So it's not a paradigm shift, it's a rejection of the Vinaya, but it's kind of opening a new chapter in the evolution of Buddhist monasticism in China, in which really the Vinaya is still a guiding principle, but the addition of new elements to monastic life, which reflect Chinese predilections, ways of thinking, and so on. Okay, so I've been talking now for a while, and maybe it's time to actually come to the main topic for today, which is Chan Buddhism, and what's the role of Chan in this whole process of the acculturation of monastic transmission and transformation of monasticism in China. Those of you who have followed those lectures probably remember, I think it was my third lecture, when I was talking about Baizhang. I mentioned the Baizhang legend about the transformation of monasticism by Baizhang by establishing the first uniquely Chan community, monastic community in China. And because of that, one of the primary ways that Baizhang is remembered within the Chan tradition or the Zen tradition in Japan, or so on in Korea, and so on, Vietnam also, is as this patron saint of Chan monasticism. The idea being that really he establishes autonomous monastic community, that is to say, it's outside of the Buddhist mainstream, outside of established monastic institutions and so on. And this is part of this drive of the Chan tradition to establish its institutional independence. Much have been written about this, including by myself, but many others. This is almost like a cottage industry in Buddhist studies, especially in Japan, but also you have fairly extensive treatment also, not too much, but you can find some in English as well. So supposedly he establishes this first independent Chan monastery in China. So you are talking here early 9th century, right? Quite early. And then he codifies the rules for his monastery, the so-called Baizhang rules of purity, Baizhang Jingui. And Jingui is a term that is used to refer to, or Baizhang Jingui, Baizhang's rules of purity, or Baizhang's pure rules. Both are viable translations. This becomes a general term for referring to Chan monastic rules. And because of that, Baizhang is celebrated as the founding patriarch, or the founding father or patron saint of what we can refer to as Chan monasticism. But what exactly is Chan monasticism, and what is its relationship with non-Chan or other monasticism? The problem with the Baizhang legend is that really there's very little support in terms of other documents about what was happening in Chan Buddhism at the time. There is this short text in this major chronology of history of Chan that was published in 1004, Janmen Guisho, the rules for the Chan school, which kind of, there is a sense of Baizhang establishing some kind of BHU, separate place, you can say, for his community. But this text is well over a century after Baizhang's passing away. And also when you see, Baizhang is actually a name of a mountain, right? When we say Baizhang in Chan studies, we mean for the most famous monk associated with the mountain, which established the monastery in the mountain. But actually that monastery continued, and there were many Baizhang Chan masters, kind of famous, not as famous as the Baizhang in question, but there was a whole lineage of abbots of this monastery community. So Baizhang can just refer also to particular monastic community at Baizhang mountain. But anyway, so the problem with this code, with these rules that Baizhang supposedly establishes, that no such text exists, and there is no evidence that it ever existed. So we really don't know. I mean, he established some kind of rules, but what exactly were the rules about and so on. And so most likely, there was nothing of that sort, that really Baizhang never established anything. I mean, yeah, he was an abbot of community, and of course there was maybe some unique features of monastic life and so on. But the whole legend about this kind of new sectarian tradition that emerges, and new patterns of monastic life that was completely separated, rejected the Vinaya, that's more of a stuff of both religious and scholarly imagination than historical reality. So various scholars have been trying to reconstruct his code, but it's kind of, this is like, what a good analogy is here, basically making up stuff, right? Reimagining something that probably never really existed. And then later codes, so we have during the Sung dynasty and then Yuan dynasty also later on a variety of codes about Chan monasteries. And they do evoke the authority of Baizhang, but he almost becomes like a symbol of Chan monasticism, or his role is kind of more symbolic, or and it's kind of embedded in this legend. And so we have, for example, rules of purity for Chan monasteries from early 12th century by Chan monk, Zhanglu Zhongzi. So this is very large. The first 7 fascicles are translated by a nun from Taiwan. But so this is important, and it's supposed to be about Chan monastery, but here we're talking about, this is like 3 centuries after Baizhang's passing away. And then we have others where actually sometimes Baizhang is embedded in the title. And also what's important about these rules is actually they were initiated by the imperial governments. Is the government telling certain monks, why don't you create this set of rules for something we call Chan monastery? But actually the notion of a Chan monastery actually only appears centuries after Baizhang's time. That really, Chan monastery is some separate designation. This is a Sung dynasty invention. So this whole thing about the Baizhang legend and the supposed invention of a new paradigm of monastic life that is unique to Chan is often interpreted in both traditional and contemporary context, some kind of major paradigm shift, right? As I already mentioned. So the Chan tradition rejects the Vinaya as something that is foreign to China, is embedded in Chinese tradition, that is not relevant both to realities of Chinese social, cultural, or religious life, but it's also kind of not in tune with Chan ideas. There's this notion of Chan iconoclasm, Chan monks, they are, too free, too unrestrained, too spontaneous. They cannot be bothered about this minutiae of Vinaya rules and regulations and so on. They transcend all these distinctions and so on. So, so this becomes so this is celebrated in East Asian Buddhism as the development of uniquely Chinese system of Buddhist monasticism. And this is also embedded in this notion of Chan iconoclasm that I mentioned early on in some of my previous lectures, that there are various stories of Chan monks not following conventional rules of morality, behaving in unconventional ways. The notion that Chan is unique, that transcends, if it transcends the Dharma in a sense of the canon, right? This was my last lecture, that Chan have nothing to do with words and letters. Well, the Vinaya, at least as a literature, is words and letters. The scriptures are also words and letters. So Chan is direct transmission of the essence of Buddhist life. And who is going to bother with all this minute rules about decorum and how to put your robes and when to eat and what to eat and this and that? So this is this kind of notion of both Chan iconoclasm and the uniqueness of Chan vis-a-vis the rest of Buddhism. So for example, you have this painting here, you can see this is a contemporary of Baizhang. His name is Dan Xia, kind of fairly important master in the context of Chan Buddhism at the time. So the story goes that it was cold somewhere in China, and it was winter, and he wanted to warm himself up. So he went to the Buddha hall, pick up the wooden Buddha image, chop it, and make a bonfire so that he can warm himself up. So the painting is described, so you can see here. Let me see if I can do this. No, sorry. I don't have the, okay, you can see it. I cannot magnify it because of the other screen, how things are set up on my computer right now. But here you can see this is the Buddha image burning. He's warming himself, and another monk comes and says, "What are you doing?" I mean, don't try to do this in Thailand, for example. Now they're going to arrest you because this is sacrilegious, right? To burn a Buddha image. But the basic idea being, burning a Buddha is not a piece of wood, right? The image is the symbol of the Buddha, but the real Buddha is to be found within the mind, and so on and so forth. So this is the story probably is not historical. It's something that was created later, or maybe even there was something like that. But the idea is that really Chan monks are unconventional spiritual virtuosos who are not constrained by normal rules of behavior or petty details of monastic etiquette or something like that. He wants to make a point here. The point is that the real Buddha is not to be found within a piece of wood in the main hall into the monastery, and that worshipping that is not really real practice. The real practice is to be found by looking from the real Buddha within the mind. Right? I mean, that's at least one interpretation of the story, probably the most conventional one. So this is this is how this story of Baizhang, the rules and new paradigm shift and new mode of monasticism emerges. But it's a very problematic story. And the historical reality behind what was happening in China, especially in the context of Chan Buddhism, is a little bit different. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it in 2 minutes after we have our break. So let's have a break. For those of you who are new, we usually have a 2-minute break in between so that we can start and walk and pick up some more water or whatever. So let's do that, and then we can reconvene. So 2 minutes, that's 120 seconds. So see you. I didn't time myself, but I hope it was around. I didn't spoke. I hope it was not too off from 2 minutes. So, so if you don't mind, I would like to continue. So basically, when I stopped, I was talking about this notion that the emergence of unique pattern of monastic life developed by the Chan school represented a major shift in the history of Chinese Buddhism, a move away from the Vinaya rules and regulations that were imported from India, and celebration of Chinese outlooks, Chinese mores, Chinese ways of understanding and practicing Buddhism that were at odds with what was transpiring in India before. And of course, not just India, but Central Asia and so on. But really, what happened in China, the notion of Chan monastery as a category, by and large, was something that was instituted by the imperial state. So this was basically a government designation. Doesn't mean that there were no monasteries in China where, the abbot will be Chan. You can refer to Matsu's or Baizhang's or Nanchuan's monastery. These are names of famous Chan monks from the Tang Dynasty, or even early on, the monasteries of Hongren and Daoxin, the so-called 4th and 5th patriarch. I mean, you can refer to them as Chan monastery in a sense of that the abbot or the leader of the monastic community is regarded to be Chan master. They practice certain way of Buddhism that is distinctive and so on. So we discussed that, but it's an official designation. Then the notion of Chan monasteries really develops much later during the Sung dynasty. So kind of several centuries after these famous monks lived. And basically, the state decides to to divide the monastery, at least the major monasteries, in terms of three major categories, and Chan is one of those categories. And then when you have the special category, so-called Chan monastery, Chan Yuan, which is distinct from teaching monasteries, which by this time mostly means Tiantai monasteries, and Vinaya monastery is just a general kind of designation for whatever doesn't fit into this. Then you have to have rules. So some of the earlier codes, monastic codes for Chan monasteries were influenced by this development in terms of nomenclature. But if you look, first of all, if you look at the so-called rules for Chan monasteries, and this is, for example, Yipai have written very nicely on this, and others have picked up on this theme, including myself, the Chan rules do not represent much of a paradigm shift. They're pretty conservative actually in character. Yeah, they maybe move away from the Vinaya in certain areas, or maybe we respond to certain social, cultural, religious realities that are peculiar to China. For example, you have discussion about tea ceremony and things like that. But really, they are not, certainly they do not reflect any countercultural or iconoclastic ethos. They are very, very conservative. It's a conservative monastic community. By the Sung dynasty, Chan is the mainstream. Chan is at the core of institutionally supported, government-aligned, elite form of Buddhism that is prevalent in China. And the rules reflect that. It's a very, very conservative tradition. So the function of the rule here is really to complement rather than replace the Vinaya precept. So this whole notion that there was wholesale rejection of Vinaya tradition and so on doesn't bear a historical reality. And the basic argument I would try to make, I've made in some publications and I would like to reiterate today, is that Chan, and you can make the same statement about the Tiantai rules, are very much part of the evolution of monasticism in China, but they were elaborated, they're formulated, they're diffused within the context of the monastic mainstream. So in that sense, they didn't represent departure or rejection of mainstream rules and regulations and monastic aspirations and ideals and institutions, but just part of this evolving tradition. Buddhist monasticism in China from the very beginning was changing. So I'm not saying like Chinese monks follow the Vinaya tradition, down to the T, and Chinese monasticism is not different. Of course, it's different. You can go to Chinese monastery and then you can go to Theravada monastery. You can see lots of differences. Of course, also many similarities. But this pattern of change and transformation of acculturation started at the very beginning, and you can say to some degree continues to the present. And Chan, Tiantai, and so on were important actors within this transformation, but they never functioned by rejecting the tradition. They functioned within the tradition. So they were partly embedded with mainstream institutions, traditions, and so on. And as a matter of fact, if you look at Chan Buddhism, instead of rejecting the mainstream, it becomes the mainstream. By the Sung dynasty, most of the major monasteries in China are designated as Chan monasteries. So in a sense, Chan is not the counterculture, not the progressive tradition who challenges authority and so on. Certainly, maybe you can make those arguments in some context, maybe for the Tang dynasty, Chan, but the Sung dynasty, it's a very, very conservative tradition, firmly entrenched in the socio-political status quo, patronized by the elites and so on, for better or worse, or both, better and worse, depending on context. So let me briefly introduce some Chan texts, which kind of actually were written, unlike the pure rules of Baizhang that scholars have imagined what must have looked like. Actually, we have some texts by famous Chan masters that talk about monastic life. So let's see what they have to say. So I would like to focus on two texts, and I've translated both of them. So if you are interested, you can look at my publications. And I've written also about this whole trajectory of monasticism, also about the Huiyuan story. I've written about that kind of the integration of Buddhist institution within the political system of China, of medieval China, and so on. But let me briefly summarize. So the first one is by Guishan. So he's one of the most famous Chan masters from the second half of the Tang dynasty in terms of his lineage. He was a teacher of his teacher was Baizhang, who was a disciple of Matsu, so kind of in line of some of the monks I've been speaking before. And the second one is a little bit later. It's from the early 10th century, so from the very end of the Tang dynasty, another very famous monk, Xie. And again, to remind you, you can put Zheyi's, the Li Jiefa, establishing regulations within the same genre. So you have Tiantai monk, Chan, actually they're very, very similar, especially as I've shown in some of my publications, Xiefeng's rules and Zheyi's rules are very, very similar. So they're part of this whole new chapter in which Chinese monks formulate rules for their own communities, but not to reject or do away with the Vinaya, but to supplement, to address particular issues that are relevant to their own communities. So in Guishan, much of Guishan's text is about critique of monastic deviancy. So many of the things we associate, at least in popular imagination, of Chan monks doing weird stuff, misbehaving, and kind of transgressing rules and so on, he says, no, this is not the way to behave at all. So he describes all kinds of corrupt attitudes and practices he observed in the monastic communities and highlights that this is very inappropriate, very detrimental for Buddhism, and basically calls monks that do not behave appropriately, tells them to knock it off, and tells them what are the bad consequences for not following the rules and leading exemplary lives. So this is one passage where he's describing these corrupt monks. As such, corrupt monks do not observe the lesser regulations, the minor rules of deportment. They cannot guide the new generations of monks. And this is very important, how the tradition is transmitted. So, but if the monks, the senior monks are really bad, then who is going to teach the new monks? Consequently, new students have no one to emulate as a model of proper behavior. When others reprimand them, they say, I'm a mountain monk. This is this kind of iconoclastic image, like I cannot be bothered with this. I'm a mountain monk, I've transcended all these kind of rules and regulations, cannot be bothered with that kind of stuff. As they are unfamiliar with the teachings of Buddhism, constantly their dispositions and actions are unbecoming and crude. Views of that kind all come from immature minds. And by the way, by Chinese, I did this translation a long time ago, maybe 15 years ago, something like that. The text is a little bit difficult. So, I mean, if I go there, maybe I will change a few things, and if you have some better ideas, but that's the basic idea. All right, and then he continues in another passage. So, as they're lazy and greedy, as time slowly slips by, they eventually become abominable persons. Unaware, they will in due course start staggering and become old and useless. When they encounter various circumstances, they will not know what to do, like someone facing a wall. When asked about the teachings of Buddhism by younger students, they have no words of guidance. Eventually, when they have something to say, their words do not accord with the scriptures. Sometimes, when younger monks speak lightly of them, they reprimand them. Lacking good manners, they become angry and rancorous, and when they angers another. So this is like grumpy, old, crude, vulgar men in monastic robes that misbehaves and of course represents bad image. So here we are as far removed from this kind of images of China iconoclasm as it's possible to imagine. If I can insert a sidebar here, personal reflection from my own experience. This notion of Chan iconoclasm was embedded in Western imagination through the writings of Suzuki, where he is representing these notions of Zen as some kind of pure essence of religion, which transcends all these rules and regulations and kind of this Chinese transformation revolution of Buddhism. Huiyuan also, actually, the famous intellectual from Republican China, also was, I mean, they were disagreeing among themselves, but Huiyuan was also seeing Chan as this kind of rejection of foreign, bad Indian Buddhism and kind of moving in the Chinese direction. But really what we have, so this kind of notion, and then I think both Japanese and Western scholars pick up on this, the Chan monks, instead of just practicing, studying scriptures and so on, they go around and they engage in these encounter dialogues. They ask some strange questions that must have beat them up and they scream or something. And this is how they cultivate their wisdom, right? This is how they practice. This becomes a mode of practice. Encounter dialogue between master and disciple becomes the real mode of practice, which replaces other practices. Now, as I mentioned before, I entered monastic life when I was only 18. I mean, I was born in Europe and so on. And so I kind of started reading Suzuki and so on. So I had this idea, but then when I was living in actual monastic communities, which obviously 20th century East Asia is different than Tang China, but human nature, I'm afraid, haven't changed much. I mean, the notion that you can have a monastic community in which there will be no rules and regulations, and there will be emphasis on spontaneity, and people will engage in this kind of iconoclastic, that's just complete nonsense. I mean, it's never going to function. You cannot have, I mean, even with rules and regulations and all kinds of exemplary modes of conduct, people are hopeless. I mean, it's very difficult to have people just get caught up into, even if they're sincere practice, and imagine they have all kinds of people who enter monastic life for reasons other than religious piety or desire to practice and transcend samsara or anything like that. So you have all this bunch of people, all kinds of stuff going on in the monastery, and then you have no rules, and then you encourage people to scream and shout and engage in this inscrutable utterances. This is based on some models of supposedly enlightened behavior, which have nothing to do, historically speaking, with the figures. I mean, as I explained, these are later accounts of what supposedly transpired, which were more literary artifacts and works of fiction rather than actual reports of what was happening. So for me, this kind of notion, you know, that you can have a viable monastic community without rules and regulations, without this kind of ideals of what monastic life is just pure fantasy. Just in terms of how we human beings are structured, it's just never going to work. I'm all for freedom and spontaneity. I mean, it's great. It's just not viable. It's pure fantasy. It's utopian vision. Anyway, okay, so much of Guishan's text is about criticism of wayward monastics and so on, but he also in other parts of the treatise or the essay, he provides a vision of exemplary monkhood. So what monks should be like. So this is his version of some of the verses we read in the Dhammapada, from the Dhammapada, right? So let's say how he described exemplary monks. So the Buddha first established the Vinaya and began to enlighten his disciples. The monastic regulations and pure rules of dignified deportment are pure like ice and snow. By observing the precepts and ceasing transgressions, monks control their initial spiritual resolve. The detailed regulation correct all that is crude and unwholesome. When someone has not yet gone to the teaching side of the Vinaya, how can they evaluate the superior vehicle of definitive meaning? So this is kind of Mahayana, kind of superior vehicle, Changshang and so on. But basically, if you want to reach the higher reaches of Buddhist spirituality, you have to be grounded in basic ethics and the monastic deportment and so on. It's such a pity when a whole life is passed in vain, and regretting afterwards about missed opportunities will be of little avail. And in another part of the treatise, he mentions, like he says, you follow your desires about this dissolute, misbehaving monks, you follow desires, but you create lots of bad karma, and then you die as miserable old men, and then your next life probably is not going to be very, very good. So you waste your whole life just pursuing desires. And actually, from his perspective, and this is all of this, you can put in the context of Theravada or whatever, Indian monasticism, and some it will make perfect sense. So there's actually very little that is unique Chan. There's some part of the essay where he articulates uniquely Chan perspective, or basically tries to relate this to Chan vision of the path. But in terms of the rules and the precepts, I think those of you who studied maybe other Buddhist tradition, I think you can reflect and you can see that very much tallies with that. So there is lots of discussion about this kind of ideal, but also warning. And from this perspective, it's much worse to be bad monk than to be a good layman, right? I mean, monastic life, just by putting the robes, doesn't make you a holy person. Conversely, actually make it even worse, because if you pretend to be a good monastic and then you don't follow the rules and are not good example and don't strive to at least improve yourself to some degree, then you create bad karma, because people support you and you waste their support. You have to lie to them to pretend to be something you are not, and so on. So actually, if there is a good way to accumulate lots of bad karma, is to become a monastic and then not to try to live your life according to the lofty ideals of monasticism. So, and then he goes on to elaborate, like, what's the meaning of leaving home, right? Chuchia. Those who have left home, having set off towards a transcendental direction, differ from lay people in their minds and their external appearance. Again, this notion of monastic distinction, monks are different than other people. And that starts with appearance, shaven head, robes, and so on. But also their mind is different, because they cultivate themselves spiritually, they dedicate themselves to a process of spiritual cultivation and so on. So they cause the seed of sanctity, or the seed of Buddhahood, the Buddha nature, to continue to flourish and make Maras. Mara is the personification of evil in Buddhist mythologies. Mara's army tremble with fear. They repay the four kinds of benevolence. This is typical Chinese concept. In safe living, beings probably is missing. They are in the three worlds. If you are not like that, then you falsely pretend to be a member of the monastic order. So this is the template. This is the ideal that you have to follow. And if you don't follow it, you mislead yourself, but more importantly, you mislead others. Very briefly, I would like to, I think we have several questions. Maybe we can address that, but let me also give you a couple of passages from Xie code. And basically, Xie code it's kind of shortish. It starts with this introductory paragraph, which he talks about the importance of monastic discipline, and then he gives a series of rules. So the structure is very similar actually to Jie's code from early 7th century. So he's basically here talking about the importance of monastic discipline. So those who have left home, or those who have become monks, first of all, must follow the monastic rules and regulations and be solemn and strict in their practice. Once the practice is pure, then it can be said, that person is fit to call on and select an enlightened teacher, and then he can discern the teacher's essential principle. However, the correct way is quiescent. It pervades the past and the present without anyone coming across it. It encompasses the major things in the universe without ever being true. This kind of thing is spoken of in terms of the ways of the world. If holding steadfastly to the teaching of Buddhism, one dwells peacefully by relying on the semblance teachings, putting away personal feelings, one comes to live together with other monks in the monastery. One who wishes to cause them to be like the 100 rivers which all go back to a single source, and the multitude of streams which all reach the great sea. So this is kind of an ideal of proper monastic life and proper monastic community. So he starts the treatise. And then, I'm sorry to bore you, but the rules are very, very practical. And if you're not into too much, it's not a very entertaining reading. There's nothing dramatic. So for example, one of the rules about taking care of sick and elderly monks. So basically he's saying is okay, if there's some monks who are old and sick, and this is practical aspect of monastic life, you know, people get old, so you have old or sick monks, so what do you do? Well, if they cannot take care of themselves, then you should have somebody else take care. So first, the postulants. So these are people who train themselves. They are still lay people who perhaps want to become monastics. They should take care. But if there are no postulants around, then novices should undertake this duty. If there are no novices, that fully ordained monks should take the duty. So there's a sense of hierarchy, which is the monastic hierarchy. I mean, this is the same. If it's in Theravada monastery, it will be exactly the same hierarchy, right? So ultimately, nobody should avoid this duty. So this is rule 3. Then in rule 4, and this again breaks this idea of agrarian community, Baizhang, cultivating the land, monks living off the land, and kind of pastoral lifestyle and so on. It kind of depicts more what was historically accurate representation of monastic life, that really monks didn't work in the land. They were supposed to be practicing or something like that, but monasteries had quite a bit of land, so somebody had to manage the land. And also another source of income was religious rites. So here basically he says, if the donors from the local community, so local people who with pure hearts request politely, so they come and politely request Buddhist chant, then you should provide that kind of service. Now, they're not saying monks should just be like paid ritual specialists or singers, just do ancestor worship rituals and just pocket the money and just be obsessed with that kind of wealth generation. But performing rituals for the lay people is part of life, and he wants to regulate that. So there are other rules. So they are also he is dealing with other aspects, like that monks do not behave properly. How do you deal with them? So you have about punishments for monks who misbehave. The worst punishment is to kick them out. Like if they really, really do something bad, or if they cannot correct themselves, you just kick them out of the monastery. And also I mentioned about this notion of the economic foundation of monastic life, at least according to today's text, was landed estate. And we know that from historical record to be the case, that monks were not really living in self-supporting communities where they were tilling the land and producing vegetables. I mean, they might have had some vegetable garden or something like that. But this kind of notion of self-sustaining agrarian Chan communities or Zen communities never corresponded to reality, for better or worse. So these are some of the rules there. So here you can see the practical aspects of this. And in the time I have, I would like to just go over a couple of other passages by other Chan masters, which also describe the monastic ideal. The first one is actually by a contemporary of Baizhang. And a Chan master known as Huiyuan, he was also a disciple of Matsu. So there is a passage in one of his sermons that goes like this: the way of our Chan school is different. And here definitely here's this kind of notion that I mentioned, that some Western scholars argue that there was no Chan school at this period. It's kind of complete nonsense. I mean, you have quite a few references in sermons, but also in still inscriptions. Clearly, they are talking about Chan school. So the way of our Chan school is different. After the ancient monks attained realization, they went to live in thatch huts and stone houses. They used old cauldrons with broken legs to cook their food, and passed 20 or 30 years in that way, unconcerned about fame and wealth. They never thought of money and riches, completely forgetting about human affairs. They concealed their traces among rocks and thickets. When summoned by the monarchs, They would not respond. When invited by the princess, they would not go. How can they be the same as those who, greedy for fame and desirous for wealth, sink into the worldly ways? That's like a peddler who, by seeking small profit, loses great gain. So he contrasts this, he first articulates this vision of monastic life, which is almost like, not almost, but it's a eremitic idea of going to mountain, living pure life, simplicity, and so on. Again, you can translate this in another language or put it in the context of other tradition. I mean, there are some elements that are, of course, uniquely Chinese, but the general idea, I think, correspond to these hallowed images of exemplary religiosity we associate with monastic life in Buddhism. And then he contrasts that with other monks who are greedy for fame and wealth. And I'm sure you can find lots of examples both in history and contemporary Buddhism of that kind. And by following, by kind of having this kind of desire for wealth, for fame and so on, they think they gain something, but they lose what's really precious, is the experience of awakening, the realization of the Buddhist truth, and the bringing that truth into the world. And then going back to Baizhang, this is from one of his sermons. So Ren in this context means monastics, and you will see the aspects of the sermon that kind of indicate that it's a general term. Doesn't necessarily have to mean monastic, basically means practitioners, but in this case, he's talking about monastics. I mean, a person who studies the ways encounters all kinds of painful or pleasant, agreeable or disagreeable situations. His mind does not recoil. So this is the virtue of equanimity. Not thinking about fame and profit, robes and food, and not being greedy for any merit and blessings. He's not obstructed by anything in the world. With nothing dear, free from love, he can equally accept pain and pleasure. He uses a coarse robe to protect himself from the cold, and simple food to support his body, letting go, like a fool, like a div, like a dumb person. It's only then that one gains some understanding. If one uses one's mind to engage broadly in intellectual study, seeking merit and wisdom, all of that is just birth and death or samsara. It does not serve any purpose as far as reality is concerned. Blown by the wind of knowledge, such person drowns in the ocean of birth and death. Again, it's a very nice passage, at least from my perspective. And you can see here, he's evoking monastic idol where he talks about robes and food. So these are some of the basic requisites, coarse robe, right? Again, in the middle part and so on. Then the passage here, he talks about like a fool, like a thief, like a dumb person. This is the opposite of very worldly monk who is organizing temples and running corporations and building Buddhist empires and having lots of disciples and putting his statue in front of the Buddha hall or something like that, as you know from some of the contemporary monks we have in the Chinese cultural sphere. And then so this is kind of, again, resonates with these hallowed monastic ideals, which you find in Chan Buddhism, but also you find outside of Chan Buddhism. So what can we conclude from what I told you so far? First of all, to reiterate that monasticism have been an important part of Buddhism from the very inception of the religion. And of course, we have traditions of Buddhism where monasticism is not central. I mean, later on they're developed. You have Nyingma in Tibetan Buddhism. Japanese Buddhism is pretty much lay Buddhism, even though you have a clergy which kind of follows maybe some aspects of Chinese monasticism or monasticism imported from China, but by and large, kind of monasticism is central for understanding the story of Buddhism. Now, that doesn't mean there is another aspect of Buddhism, of course, the important participation of lay people, and I'm going to talk about it later on when I talk about the tongue literati and Buddhism and poetry and so on. So this is not to say that Buddhism is all about monastics or everybody becomes have to become a monastic. Far from that. As a matter of fact, the message here is that really, if you cannot dedicate yourself fully to monastic life and lead exemplary monastic life, you shouldn't become a monastic, because it's better to be a lay person than to be incompetent, bad, corrupt, dissolute monastic. But monasticism is central for understanding Buddhism, and certainly that also applies to the case of Chan. So this is the context. All these sermons we have, all these stories and so on, they evolved within the context of monastic communities. So something that was meant, like for example, when Linchi says, kill the Buddha, kill the patriarchs. So you have to understand it in the context of the community. I mean, if he ever said such a thing, let's assume that was the actual sermon. Probably I personally think probably he said something along those lines. So what he's saying is, like, within Buddhism, I mean, of course, people outside of Buddhism, they maybe don't care, they're disrespectful. I was just told some movie star in Hollywood have Buddha images in his toilet or something like that, which was given to me as an example of very bad secular behavior in America. But what you have here, it's a mode of life in a mode of practice that where really monasticism is very central, very important. And then going back to the Linchi sermon about killing the Buddha, so what he's saying is not that you should engage in iconoclastic acts, I mean, a piece on Buddha or burn a Buddha image or something, or do something weird or scream in the Buddha hall or something like that. But the notion of a Buddha, so because that's taken for granted. You live in a monastic community, you have morning service, you have meditation, so it's a disciplined life. So that's not something that he's challenging. I mean, that's the reality of the community in which this sermon is given. What he's saying, you have to take a step further. You have to, yes, you live disciplined monastic life, but like the story of the simile of the raft and so on, you shouldn't be attached to all these visible aspects of Buddhism. You shouldn't be attached to rituals. You shouldn't be attached to specific practices. I mentioned it in the context of Kankwason and various forms of meditation and so on. So yes, you live disciplined life. You try to dedicate yourself to the cultivation of virtue, but ultimately, at the same time, you should transcend all of it. As a matter of fact, you should transcend the whole realm of dualities. And the image of the Buddha you have is just your own construct. It's not the real Buddha. So you have to kill the Buddha that you have constructed. Certainly you have to kill the Buddha that you think by worshiping him, he will give you, he will respond, he will give you some kind of worldly benefits, or the notion that you will get married. I mean, this is what drives Buddhist spirituality, right? So it's kind of the more money you give, the more merit you generate, and then better karma and rebirth and so on. So he said, you have to transcend all of that. And in order to do that, you have to ultimately kill the Buddha. You have to kill Buddhism. You have to transcend Buddhism. But that's very sound Buddhist teaching. I mean, it's kind of, you start with following rules, precepts, regulations, you cultivate yourself to provide guidance, inspiration. But at some point, you have to go beyond Buddhism. You have to go beyond Buddha, because Buddha, at least the way you understand, is just a concept you create in your mind with your limited understanding and limited consciousness. The real Buddha is beyond forms, beyond signs, and so on. Of course, there's the historical Buddha, but he's not talking about that. Obviously, you cannot kill the historical Buddha. He died away a long time ago. So he's talking about this kind of Buddha as an object of attachment. So if you're attached to the Buddha, you have to kill that Buddha. If you're attached to anything, you have to kill that, because ultimately you have to transcend everything. But complete transcendence doesn't imply removing yourself from the realm of suffering, being from the realm of imperfection, from the realm of duality. You transcend, and at the same time, are able to function in the world. As a matter of fact, you become better equipped to engage with others, to bring wisdom, compassion, to live a meaningful life, and so on. So that's the basic idea. In order to understand some of the higher teachings, you have to understand the historical context in which they were enunciated, and that was a context in which monasticism was very, very important. And in terms of Chan monasticism, there are two ways we can misinterpret. One is the traditional misinterpretation that this was a paradigm shift, that they rejected the Vinaya, they kind of didn't want to do anything in Indian tradition. It was something that was uniquely Chinese, and then of course transmitted to Japan or whatever, Korea, and then became uniquely Japanese or Korean or Vietnamese or whatnot. That's problematic narrative that really, if you look at the history, that's one-sided, that's not what really transpired. The other misunderstanding, and for example, some of my early books on Chan, people, especially scholars, people who are outside of scholar community, at least the smart ones, they actually understood better, but was that, oh, this is the same as the rest of Buddhism, like, oh, this is the Chan monks are just doing same old boring Buddhism. And some people are disappointed because we wanted to have monastic who are kind of like a hippies in the 60s, rejecting established mores and kind of engaging counterculture and something like that. So this was like, oh, you're saying this was like something else. That's not exactly what I'm saying. They introduced new elements in monastic life. They participated in evolution. The monastic life in China was never static, it was evolving, and certainly emergence of Chan was very important, but it was not a complete paradigm shift. It was a gradual process of developing certain forms. And always the Indian tradition, the canonical information, the whole of ideals of eremitic life, of pure practice, of contemplative lifestyle, they're always there as operating principles, as ideals to be followed, to be celebrated, and so on, and maybe reframed in different ways by using different terminology, embedded in different contexts, and so on. So this is kind of a balanced approach, I think. So I would call for a little bit understanding of the context and the nuance, and understanding also all this interpretive distortion, why they occur, like why Chinese tradition is reimagined in different ways that might not be particularly accurate representation of historical reality. I'm not to criticize. I mean, it's not just to follow historical reality. I understand people create their own ideas, their own mythologies, their own templates of understanding, and so on. But from my perspective, and I can put myself in my shoes as, when I was a monastic myself, but also as a scholar, understanding what really transpired, of having a more clear, accurate understanding of text, circumstances, ideas, how evolved, they change, why they change, is never unhelpful, even though as we learn more, we might develop different attitude, maybe a sense of cynicism, maybe a little bit critical understanding of contemporary developments, and so on. But ultimately, I suppose it's about knowledge, it's about truth, it's about reality. So whatever can help, whether it's ultimate truth or conventional truth, why not embrace it and engage with the quest for nuance, understanding, and appreciation of context, and so on. And as I end this, I would like to also highlight that this is still an enduring tradition, right? These kind of ideals that I've been speaking about, the texts I've been talking about, they're still very much part of a living tradition. As a matter of fact, the image here, I was in California, as I mentioned at the beginning, for 2 weeks, which is why we had to reschedule some, we had to schedule a gap in our schedule of lectures. So this picture I just took 2 days ago. There is a new Son, or Chan, Korean term for Chan, or Zen in Japanese, meditation center in Los Angeles. I just visited and I spent some time with the nun there, and they were very hospitable and so on. And the other picture, the picture up, was I just took it the week before. So this is just new, not of the printing press, but new of my phone camera, right? And this was a very vibrant Zen community in the 80s, 90s, and then kind of declined. There was some kind of scandal. And then this monk, well, not really monk, a priest within this tradition who have been engaged with Buddhism for a long time, is interested to revive some of the programs. And then the other one is also a recent photo of myself giving a lecture at the Chan Center in Tallahassee. This is in Florida. About 2.5 hours drive from here. This particular lecture, actually, they film it, so you can find it on YouTube. But and it was very interesting. I don't go to Buddhist groups too much, so I kind of decided to start to look, because I'm mostly interested in historical stuff and classical text and tradition and so on. But recently I decided to look at contemporary developments within Buddhism, especially as it pertains to meditation communities. And of course, that reinforces something that, of course, I was already aware, that this is still a living tradition, and the text and the traditions and so on that I'm talking about, they're still informing the practices, the attitudes, the aspirations of people around the world. And what I hope these lectures are doing is they are helping to provide additional information, additional perspective, additional appreciation of some of the nuances, and better understanding the tradition as a whole within its whole historical richness and complexity and so on. There's much more to be said, but perhaps I should stop at this point. There's not much time for question and answer, but we can perhaps entertain.
There are a few questions. So how does the Chan monastic rule deal with violence?
With violence?
Yeah.
Well, there are two things here. When you talk about violence, let me just open this.
It has several other aspects that the question is asked. Is it forbidden or not? Yeah.
These are good questions. I'm sorry, I didn't realize deal with violence. Yeah, I mean, violence, first of all, there's violence. The rules, the monastic rules about life in a monastic community, how to order a community, how monks should behave, and so on. And especially the Chinese rule, the Vinaya, actually the Vinaya is more broad in the Indian or the Pali tradition, because much of the Vinaya is not just about how monks should behave within the context of monastic life, but how they should engage with the laity, right? And one of the major impulses for the creation of the Vinaya is to make sure that monks were very respected. They behaved in ways that was exemplary, that elicit respect from the lay people or from society as a whole. Right, so that's why the Buddha would say you shouldn't behave like that, because people will look around and that will reflect a bit on the monastic community of Buddhism in general. So, but then how do you talk about violence? And so there's violence in the world, like what the rules have to say. For example, we have now war in Ukraine, right? So the rules are obviously not addressing those kind of issues. They're about monastic life, but more generally, I mean, yeah, this is a good question. I would suggest to wait about this, because I have a lecture on this topic when I talk about, there's this famous story of Nanchuan killing a cat. So this is, maybe I can address in more detail when I talk about it. But this becomes an interesting, so how do you interpret violence? Like killing a cat obviously is a violence. How do you interpret violence? Violence also in terms of like when monks fight, yeah, there are rules like that, you know, and one of the ways to deal with it is if monks are violent in the context of, I don't know, like for example, I remember when I went first time as a monastic at Huiyuan, I was staying in some monastery, and there was some kind of commotion, and I asked the abbot what's going on, and he said, oh, that the two monks started, one of the monks hit the other monks, they started to fight or something like that. So obviously you have to deal with that. So you can discipline monks, or you can, if they're really hopeless cases, they don't change the way you kick them out of the monastery, but that's the best you can do. But I will talk about this. Yeah, this is a good question, and actually it's by Yuan. Thank you, Yuan. That's a good question. She's a graduate student of mine, actually, so I appreciate she listening and asking this. So maybe we can talk about it much more when we talk about this particular Changongan, and Changongan in more general, when we talk about this kind of transgressive, not just violence, but transgressive behavior. So thank you for that.
Yeah, there's another question.
Let's see. Okay, John McCrae, 1986, book Norton School of Chan Buddhism. Seated meditation using the philosophy of the support. Not so much the philosophy of the Vimala Sutta scripture. I don't know. I have the book here. I don't have time to go to the exact page. The general philosophy, I mean, in a sense of the philosophy, there are two levels here. One is pretty much the outlook of the Vimala scripture sutra is kind of more Madhyamika than like Tathagata Garbhan Yogacaras. It's about non-duality, it's about emptiness, it's about transcendence. So maybe the general worldview of the Vimalakirti Sutra, not just about the Norton school, but for example, if you look at some of the stuff I've written about the Hungcho school, there are lots of references also from Vimalakirti. So the Vimalakirti is canonical text that really resonates with Chan monks from the Tang dynasty. So a number of quotation, but also there is this one passage in the scripture. What was it, Subhuti or Sariputra? I'm sorry, I'm getting old. My memory is not what it used to be. But where he's meditating in the forest, and this kind of notion that, you know, by meditating, just mechanical meditating, sitting there, you can achieve perfection and something like that. So Vimalakirti criticizes. So this could be a particular passage and could be the particular context of the Vimalakirti scripture, which definitely, in terms of his teaching of non-duality, or this notion that reality is ineffable, the Vimalakirti silence, I mentioned that in one of my earlier lectures, is very much part of the Chan outlook. And actually, if you look at many of the Chan sermons, they embed quotation from the Vimalakirti scripture, sometimes by identifying the text. So they will say Vimalakirti scripture says, sometimes just saying scripture says, and sometimes actually just embedding it without any indication that it's a quotation. So basically, the text or passage from the scripture is fully embedded. I think actually some of the examples of Chan sermons I gave you included that. I think there was a sermon from Matsu. I think when I was talking about Chan literature, I think that was the last lecture, so you can look at that. There were passages there. So, but in this particular, I have to look at McRae's book. I mean, I was reading this a long time ago when I was a graduate student. I mean, I refer to this once in a while, but I wouldn't know what exactly, so I don't want to misspeak. But I guess, but generally, it's along the lines of what I just said. Thank you, Kenneth. That was
one more question, the last
sure.
question. Yeah. What are the main differences between monastic rules of Chan and Tian Tai?
Well, so the first is, what's the difference between Chan rules and non-Chan rules? And then I haven't studied actually, to tell you the truth, because the Tian, well, okay, the Tian Tai, you have the J's rules that I mentioned. The Lichie Fa from early 7th century, that Jay created for his community. I have an article, actually, no, it's a book chapter, which I describe the evolution of Buddhist monasticism in China, and I look at that and I compare with some of the Chan texts. It's very similar, actually. It's not that different. I mean, obviously, he's speaking about specific community. So these are the rules for his monks. So he's addressing certain issues that he felt were important for his community. And then Shefeng, in his rule from the early 10th century, he's addressing certain things that are really important for his community. But there's not huge, the structure of the text is the same, the basic idea, but for example, in Tian Tai, the monastic life is organized in a slightly different way. You have monks support part of the monastery, then you have monks in the meditation hall, and then you have this retreat system in which monks go for 3 months retreats, and they practice the 4 forms of samadhi and so on. So that requires a different support structure. So there are certain elements of a monastic life in Tiantai that are different. Now, about the Sung dynasty, so after Chan developed its pure rules, in part to respond to these changes in official nomenclature instituted by the government during the Sung dynasty, then you have the development, so you have the distinction between Jiao monasteries and so on, and then there are Tiantai rules developed during the Sung dynasty. It's a very interesting topic. I haven't read and studied, so I'm afraid I have encouraged and I hope somebody can do it. It's really interesting topic. This will be a wonderful subject for a dissertation or book or translation to compare in more detail. My general idea will be there will be some elements that will be different, but some elements, much of it, maybe not as radically different as we want to think. Also, if you look at the Chan rules from the Sung dynasty, much of the stuff, it's really coming from the Vinaya. I mean, they draw elements of the Vinaya, just reframe it, or much of it is also just etiquette, like customs that were practiced in monasteries at the time, just conventions they had, just codifying it and so on. So that was reality that was on the ground. And again, obviously, if it's a Chan monastery, let's say in the Sung dynasty context, so for example, they will have meditation hall and so on. So there will be some aspect that will be distinct from a monastery where it's not Chan, not just in terms of official designation, but in terms of practice. For example, they're not going to have a meditation hall. So if you don't have a meditation hall, then you don't have need to have rules. Also, in terms of how abbotship is transmitted, so you have, this is a larger topic, by the way, probably you can notice I'm really interested in monasticism, and this is a major topic, but also you have two types of monasteries in Chinese Buddhism that continues all the way to the present. So you have Shifan Zunglin, these are like public monasteries, and the abbot, how you determine who is the abbot, like if the abbot retires and so on. So there is one set of rules, and these are also who can join this monastery. So these are monasteries that are open to all monastics, and usually those, at least in a more recent context, they will be Chan monasteries, but not always. And so this is like, you can say, a public monastery. The abbacy is determined. It's not based like the abbot passing on the abbacy to his own disciple and so on. And then the vast majority of monasteries in Chinese Buddhism are Zisung Niao, basically like a family enterprises. So you have the master, and then the master die, and then one of his direct disciples takes over, right? And it becomes, and then, so it's almost like when you have a family business, right? In China, so you have the patriarch dies, the father then goes to the eldest son, and then he to his son, and so on. And the people who live in the monastic community are all disciples of the master. And so you have these two models, and this is actually something I gave once lecture on this topic when I was in Taiwan I was asked for some conference or something like that. But it's a very interesting topic to relate that this model of two types of monastery, closed system, which is kind of like a family oriented, almost like a family enterprise, and then the public system, which is open to all monastics who are properly ordained and can follow a certain path of practice. And the choices that contemporary communities, Taiwan, mainland China, elsewhere make in terms of which pattern to follow. And also if they follow one particular pattern, how sometimes misrepresent them as following another pattern and so on. So that's why I think it's a very good question. I'm sorry, actually, we are running out of time. I think I should stop, but it's a good topic. And also if somebody is interested to do more on Sung Dynasty monastic codes for Tiantai monasteries, that will be also wonderful. But I think that's all the time we have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. Today, on behalf of the Center of Buddhist Studies, we express our gratitude to you. And next week, we will be meeting again. The topic is Chan poetry and tongue literacy. So it is a 7th lecture. So same time, 8:30 to 10:30 in Hong Kong time, next Thursday. So let's see you again next week. Thank you everyone for joining today. So see you next week.
Thank you very much to you, and thank everybody to listening. And I hope some or most of you will be able to join us next week as well. So again, thank you and stay well. Bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you.